I've already done this video once, but for whatever reason, things didn't get recorded like they needed to, so we'll give it another whirl. We're looking at Chapter 11 as it relates to human growth and development. And Chapter 11 is about how it is we form relationships in young adulthood, as well as how it is we do that while moving into middle adulthood. Now, this particular chapter takes a look at adulthood in general. It considers some lifestyle factors, friendships, marriage, divorce, gay and lesbian relationships, all kinds of fun stuff. Please remember that it's important to recognize that not all relationships are always happy, positive, or healthy. Some relationships actually end up being very abusive, unproductive, and very unhealthy, which is the dark underbelly of relationships. Some parts of the chapter will deal with the family life cycle model. We'll also look at intimate and social relationships and how they have provided important themes of development from infancy through adulthood. I'll try to be a little more loose this time around as I go about it. There's not much sense in y'all being bored out of your ever-loving minds when I'm trying to give you some decent information. If I work real well, maybe I can give it to you in such a way that it comes off a little more like it would be in class. And for those of you who don't know me in the classroom, I'm a whole lot more flexible, a whole lot more engaged and willing to chase bunny trails than I have to be or than I can be when I'm looking at a video I have to produce for you, so that at least you've got some kind of material access. So we'll give it a whirl and see how things work out this go around. We're going to start, of course, with relationships. There's a whole bunch of them. We'll start with friendships as the beginning place. Friendships in young adulthood are extremely important, especially for individuals as they move into their 20s. As they begin to age past that, adulthood, or emerging adulthood, for example, relationships become a little less important and certainly don't have the significant drive that relationships have in younger adulthood. Levinson proposed a version of relationship building he referred to as the ABCDE model. Each one of those letters stands for something specific. A is for acquaintance, B is build-up, C is continuation, D is deterioration and ending. What that translates into is that people get acquainted with one another. Their relationship builds to some degree or other over a period of time and continues, we'll assume, for a little bit longer. Then relationships will begin to deteriorate after a time, and at some point, regardless of how, relationships end. Now, people tend to have more friendships during young adulthood than in any other period of lifespan development. Friendships are especially important for the maintaining of life satisfaction across adulthood, and people who have friendships that cross ethnic groups also have much more positive attitudes toward people with different, of course, social backgrounds. Now, there are three elements that undergird or underlie good adult friendships. There's the affective realm, or the emotional basis of a relationship. There's a communal aspect to the relationship, and there's also sociability or compatibility that help underlie the development of adult friendships. One interesting aspect related to relationships as I have aged and continued to watch social systems and family development, other particular interests, is that the growing, we'll say, of online relationships is moving at an astronomical rate. One of the important factors in those online relationships is trust. And we deal with the aspect of trust as it relates to relationship performance, which means basically what it is that either party does online, and pre-commitment, which is gained through the ability to disclose about oneself, and some other situational factors. We also deal with a number of different types of friendships as they relate to siblings. Sibling relationships are always important in young adulthood, and the importance of those relationships will vary as individuals age. Now, the importance of the relationship depends on a handful of factors. One of those is proximity. How close are you to the sibling physically? My sister lives in Maryland at the moment. Before she moved to Maryland, she lived in South Florida. Before that, she lived in Massachusetts. She's lived in a number of places, all of which, since she's been married, have been very far away from me, so she perceives the relationship we have together from a proximities perspective as somewhat distant. That's also one of the aspects that's different in how men and women do relationships in general. Proximity may not be as big a challenge for men as it can be for women. Now, the health of the individuals involved in that sibling relationship is also important. My sister is 4.5 years younger than I am, and 2 or 3 years ago, she happened to blow a heart valve. What that simply means is that her heart valve literally blew up and quit functioning. It was bleeding into her heart and into the other interior parts of her body. There was no explanation for why it stopped, but it simply quit working and blew. It didn't function at all. So she had open heart surgery before the age of 50. So her health is not quite like it might have been had she not had open heart surgery. But at the same time, she's still reasonably physically healthy, but the health that she does engage in plays an important role in how we relate with one another. From a health perspective, I'm relatively in decent physical health, and it causes unique challenges when we're visiting with one another about who is the most sick or who is the most well at a particular time. The prior relationship that we have with our siblings is also an important factor in the degree we have of relatedness, meaning how close are we in the relationship from an emotional perspective. Now, if there's the challenges that come up with sibling relationships, there are also, bear in mind, significant relationships that occur between men and women, as well as cross-sex friendships. And those types of relationships, of course, can be very complicated. See, men and women do friendship very differently, as well as they do life very differently. And in adulthood, the friendships that men and women possess will reflect a continuity in the learned behaviors that we learned while we were much younger in childhood. For example, women tend to have much more close friendships than men, and they base their friendships on the ability to commune with one another and self-disclosure. Men, on the other hand, tend to base friendships on shared activities and interests. There's also gender differences in same-sex friendships, and those patterns will explain difficulties that men and women have forming cross-gender relationships. For me, the majority of my significant relationships have always been with women. Now, I'm also telling you that to point out that it can be problematic as it relates to my wife, and she and I have been married for 28 years, which basically tells you that for the last 28 years, I have not enjoyed significant relationships with men or women. Now, do I have a friend or two that I would call very good friends who are men, and a friend or two who are very good friends and female? Yes. However, the depth of those friendships changed after I married. Now, cross-sex friendships tend to help men to have lower dating anxiety, and also to increase their capacity for intimacy. And some research even shows that men tend to overestimate and women underestimate the friend's sexual interest in them, which basically means that women think that men are less interested in them sexually than they really are. When dealing with love relationships, we might call those a little more intimately inclined relationships. Bear in mind, intimacy does not always mean sexual, but often does. Passion, intimacy, and commitment become the key components. Now, these can be used to understand how relationships develop, but a true love relationship has all three of those components. Now, early in romantic relationships, passion tends to be unusually high, but intimacy and commitment tend to be very low. Infatuation is the intense, physically based relational stage in which two people have a high risk of misunderstanding and jealousy. It's also generally short-lived as a part of relationships. Are you familiar at all with being in love at first sight? If I recall correctly, I saw recently a TV show on some cable channel somewhere or other that made reference to love at first sight, and as a result, those individuals got married, and this TV show chronicles their marriage. It was not a pretty sight. Things were ugly. But as the length of a relationship increases, intimacy and passion decrease, but at the same time, the commitment to the relationship tends to increase. Now, the best explanation that we can come up with from a research perspective about how people fall in love is simply to use what's called the authoritative mating theory, which suggests that people select mates based on their similarity to one another. Homogamy is also greater in couples that met in school. I don't know if any of you are familiar with speed dating, but it provides a way to meet several people in a very short period of time, while other elements of online dating provide ways for adults to have social or dating anxiety come down while they meet other people. Research tells us that 1 in 5 couples in the United States has met online. Difficulties exist in the accuracy of the personal descriptions used in those online profiles. We don't always speak truthfully about ourselves. Attractiveness strongly influences the initial selection process online, which can be problematic if you haven't been truthful about what it is you look like. And over 1/3 of couples who marry have first met online. Interestingly enough, there's also a new culture that is beginning to express itself online. It's referred to as the emerging hookup culture. It's increasing astronomically, and both men and women in general are interested in having hookup sex, but both men and women prefer to have a romantic relationship as well. There are also 3/4 of men and women eventually express some level of regret at having experienced hookup sex. I have a client who has a couple of significant marital issues to the point of divorce, and he's made reference to having been on Tinder more than once as the dating app, if you want to call it a date, and some of the challenges that come up with that particular idea related to being in relationship. It also tells us that research with men and women in various cultures also display different types of challenges related to the ideal characteristics that they include as being important for a mate. 2 distinct dimensions show up in that research. And the first one of those is that characteristics of a desirable mate have changed because of cultural value influence. Traditional cultures, which are cultures more Eastern inclined, have the emphasis on chastity and the homemaking ability in women, as well as ambition, industry, and financial prospects as it relates to men. I didn't say it was right, just telling you what the data says. Western cultures value these qualities to a much lesser extent, while nearly all cultures place importance on being in love and the attraction of the mate. Now, the relative importance of education, of intelligence, and social refinement is also significant as it relates to mate selection. There are a handful of cross-cultural differences as it relates to preferences for the ideal characteristics of a mate. Mate selection is complex regardless of the culture. Now, the power of the culture in shaping a mate selection cannot ever be understated. Arranged marriages focus on meeting family needs and cultural values, while the internet, urbanization, and globalization become leading factors to pressure and move individuals toward a different type of selection and commitment and away from traditional matchmaking. Some of the other developmental forces, including neuroscience and love relationships, suggest that adult relationships are complex, which to me is a no-brainer. Fisher's research tells us that love is one of the 3 discrete interrelated emotional systems. Sex drive and attachment are the other 2. Neurochemicals relate to the amphetamines in our own system. Yes, we have those. Come into play early in the process of falling in love. Neurochemistry also shifts towards substances related to morphine, which is in the human system as well in the form of endorphins, while long-term relationships are being established. Oxytocin plays a role in attractiveness as the quote-unquote cuddle hormone. Now, psychologically, intimacy is an important developmental issue, certainly in younger adulthood as well as emerging adulthood. The kinds of relationships you saw and experienced when you were children will affect how you define and act in relationships you develop as an adult. Socio-cultural forces shape the characteristics you find desirable in a mate and determine to what extent you're likely to encounter resistance. Life cycle forces also play a role. And of course, it is no secret that all types of relationships can be challenging, and some of them can even become violent. An abusive relationship is one defined not only by violence, but it is a relationship in which people become aggressive toward one another or just simply one of the partners. Battered woman syndrome occurs when a woman believes that she cannot exit a relationship because of the abusive circumstance. Now, being female, Latina, African American, and having an atypical family structure will predict the potential for victimization. Surprisingly enough, the national rates of sexual assault are beginning to decline. What's known as acquaintance rape or date rape is still a major problem, however, and college women tend to be those more likely to be victims of sexual assault. There's also a continuum of aggression and aggressive behaviors toward partners, which progresses from verbal aggression to physically aggressive behavior, and then moves to more severe physical aggressive, even to the point, in some cases, of murder. Now, men and members of the LGBTQ community also are victims of violence from their intimate partners. However, women are not as violent as men in heterosexual relationships. Bear in mind that all victims, whether men or women, gay or heterosexual, need adequate social and emotional support. Culture, of course, is also an important factor. Violence against women worldwide reflects a number of cultural traditions, beliefs, and values of patriarchal societies, which means that those cultures are much more male-driven. International data tells us that the rates of abuse in is higher in some cultures that emphasize female purity, the status of the male, as well as family honor. Cultures that emphasize honor and portray women as passive, nurturing supporters of men's activities, and that emphasize loyalty and sacrifice for the family may contribute to the toleration of abuse. There are other communities that have established shelters for battered women and their children, and programs that treat abusive men, even in many localities, are not set up to deal with the level of domestic violence that is prevalent in our culture. So after we take a look, or at least a slight peek behind the curtain of relationships in general, it's important to consider how differing lifestyles influence the development of those relationships. For example, there are some of us, and some of you perhaps, that are certainly hell-bent on being single forever. There's a number of different stereotypes and biases against single people, such as yourselves. Public policy favors married people. Let's just call it for what it is. Some rental agencies prefer married couples to single people because they sense that single people are not as emotionally stable. There's other gender differences related to singlehood. There's a significant rising pressure to marry for women. Men tend to remain single much longer in younger adulthood than do women, and fewer men than women remain unmarried through adulthood. Ethnicity is also a factor in singlehood, and it reflects the differences in both age and marriage, as well as social factors. In younger adulthood, African Americans are twice as likely to be single compared to European Americans. Among Latinos, singlehood is increasing, in part because of the average age of Latinos in the United States is lowering. It's becoming much lower than that of other ethnic groups. However, Latino men expect to marry. That's simply because it's the indication of one's social achievement. Millennials, and perhaps some of you are considered millennials, tend to remain single longer and are more likely to forego marriage in order to cohabitate. Now, the transition to permanent singlehood is very gradual. What about cohabitation? Cohabitation, from a definitions perspective, is when two people who are in a committed, intimate, and sexual relationship live together, but choose to not be married. In the United States, young adults usually cohabitate as a step toward marriage, but be aware and beware. In some European countries, cohabitation is much more common than marriage. Now, research tells us that couples that cohabitate part-time as they move toward marriage tend to try to use that as a replacement for marriage. Along with the cultural and cross-cultural differences in cohabitation, for example, it being much higher in Scandinavian countries, people who cohabitate first before they get married have a higher level of divorce rate. They also tend to be less happy. Couples that are happy actually share financial and childcare responsibilities. Now, the LGBTQ relationship has a number of different factors that predict long-term success regardless. It's become legal in some places for same-sex marriage to be available, but it's also opened up the discussion on end-of-life issues and caregiving. Living as a single LGBT person can lead to a higher degree of loneliness. Some individuals experience barriers in accessing childcare as well as health care and higher levels of social isolation. Marriage as an institution can be its own bag of tricks. It's important to create a sense of stability as well as stable identity as the foundation for intimacy. Similarity of values and interests and contributions of unique skills by each partner become important as it relates to marriage. Now we're going to use the notion of marital success as a set of umbrella terms that refers to any marital outcome like divorce. Marital quality, which is the subjective evaluation of the couple's relationship on a number of different dimensions. Marital adjustment is the degree to which a husband and a wife accommodate to each other over a certain period of time, while marital satisfaction is a global assessment of one's marriage. There are a handful of key predictors, of future success in marriage. First of all is the relative maturity of the partners involved. Homogamy is also a word that suggests the similarity of values and interests that couples share between themselves, and the feeling that a relationship is on equal footing. According to exchange theory, a marriage is based on each partner's contribution of something to the relationship that the other partner would be hard-pressed to provide. In other words, there's a benefit to being married. We tend to match ourselves with mates who provide and bring something to the relationship that we cannot provide for ourselves. Day and Gosh, two researchers in 2016, suggested some key factors that predict a successful marriage, and they include respect for the emotionality of the relationship, the attitude toward being married, the ability to express love, regard for the views and to the likings of the spouse. In other words, are you willing to do something that she wants to do instead of what you want to do? How about the ability to ignore weakness in the other spouse, sexual adjustments when they're necessary, personality temperament, personality value, another person's taste, and any number of things, as well as general interests. Those sorts of predictors suggest an interesting question. Do married couples actually stay happy? Generally speaking, marital satisfaction is highest at the beginning of one's marriage. For couples who have children, marital satisfaction tends to decline until the children leave home. Some couples never rebound, and satisfaction continues to remain low even after children have left the home, which often leads to what we call emotional divorce. Balance in the level to which spouses depend on each other will lead to strong and closer marital relationships. Carney and Bradbury in 1995 proposed a vulnerability stress adaptation model of a marriage, and it sees marital quality as a dynamic process that results from the couple's ability to handle stressful events in the context of their particular vulnerabilities and even resources. There are a number of ways to set the stage for the early years of marriage. Marriages, in all fairness, and some of you who perhaps are married may know this, those relationships are most intense in their earliest days. And that tends to be because of shared activities, the openness the individuals express to new experiences, and stress over finances that require open and honest communication. They also include couples who focus on the good and not the annoyances of the other person tend to be happier. And having children and increased stress lowers levels of marital happiness. Go figure. Now, how do we keep marriages happy? It's important for couples to be flexible, adaptable, and be willing to communicate well with the other person. You must make time for your relationship. You have to express your love to the spouse. You should certainly be available in times of need. Have some decent communication skills so that you can communicate constructively and positively. And as odd as this might sound, if you're married to someone, be interested in the other person. Be willing to confide, at least to some degree, in your spouse, and then be willing to forgive minor offenses while trying to understand the significant ones. So relationships and lifestyles that influence those relationships will also, of course, affect family dynamics across the lifespan, which leads us then to the role of parents. Although the nuclear family is the most common form of family in Western culture, the most common form of family around the world, surprisingly enough, is the extended family. Moms and dads, grandparents, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, all of those people. Now, it's also, as part of that parental role, the discussion over whether or not to have children is an important factor. Having children is stressful. And for those of you who don't have children, that may sound kind of strange. Having children is not only stressful, it's expensive. And you know what? People do it anyway. Some people actually decide to stay child-free for a number of voluntary and involuntary reasons. For example, women, at least at some higher levels of education and economic factors, will increase the likelihood of not having children. For men, neither education nor economic factors predict deciding to remain child-free. Now, the timing of parenthood is also important in understanding how involved parents are in their families versus their own careers. Older parents tend to be generally much more at ease being parents, and they tend to spend more time with their babies and are more affectionate, sensitive, and supportive. Fathers in their 30s will generally spend more time with their children, but mothers are still doing the majority of the child rearing. Again, I didn't say it was fair, I'm just telling you about the research. Women, are you ready? You all already know this, but women perform most of child rearing tasks. Now, ethnic background is also a significant factor related to family structure and the parent-family and parent-child relationship. African American families, for example, their husbands are more likely than European American husbands and fathers to help with household chores and child care. Native American parents have lost their cultural parenting skills that were traditionally a part of their culture. Specifically, children were valued, women were considered sacred and honored as women, and men cared for and protected their families, which is no longer the case. Latino and Asian American families both value familialism, which is the idea that the well-being takes place in the family system versus the individual member, and in the ability to have strong extended family relationships. Asian American families reflect higher status for males, but women are catching up, and they're expanding their own social and marital roles. Raising multi-ethnic children presents its own set of challenges that are normally not experienced by individuals of the parents of same-race children. Diverse family forms are also important. We have single parents. They're faced with many unique challenges, especially when they're women and happen to be divorced. The main problem is significantly reduced financial resources. Single mothers, in the research, are the hardest hit financial persons. Dating is often a concern for many divorced single parents, men and women. There are step relationships, foster family concerns, adoptive family, and same-sex coupling in parenting all become major issues as people move through adulthood. Each of the relationships has some very special characteristics. Many step-parents, for example, as well as stepchildren, ultimately develop decent relationships. Adoptive parents contend with attachment to birth parents on the part of the children, while adopted children may wish to locate or even meet up with their birth parents. Searches for the birth parents can strain relationships between children and their adoptive parents, while families with children adopted from another culture have their own unique challenges. Tenuous relationships with their children because the bond is easily broken for any number of reasons. Gay and lesbian parents also face numerous obstacles, but usually prove themselves to be good parents. Now, for those of us who've done the divorce thing, some of us have remarried, others of us have not. But the question still remains, who gets divorced and why? Currently, odds sit at about 50-50 that new marriages will end in divorce. Several factors, such as ethnicity and social norms, will also contribute to the increase in divorce rate. Asian Americans have the lowest rates of divorce, while African Americans have the highest rates for divorce. Reasons that people divorce include infidelity, incompatibility, drinking and drug use, and the ability to grow apart tend to be the most common reasons for divorce. Gottman and Levinson in 2000 developed two models that predict divorce early as well as later. Negative emotions being displayed during conflict between the couple predict early divorce rates, but then again, not later divorce. The lack of a positive emotional state in the discussion of events of the day and during conflict will predict later divorce, but not early divorce. Because of the high divorce rate, a number of approaches have been adopted to keep a marriage from failing, such as what's called the covenant marriage. Now, if you've done divorce, there happen to be a number of different effects that people endure as a part of that process. Divorced people sometimes find the situation and transition to singlehood very difficult. They call it divorce hangover. Forgiving the ex-spouse is an important factor for the eventual adjustment of individuals post-divorce, especially for the children involved. Women clearly have a harder time in the long run, most often because of financial concerns. Those of us who had relationships with younger children while we were divorced need to bear in mind that most mothers end up obtaining custody of their children. It puts a very high financial burden on divorced mothers. Divorced fathers pay a psychological price because it's difficult to remain involved in the lives of their children. Now, collaborative divorce is the voluntary, contractually based alternative dispute resolution process that couples often use who want to negotiate resolution to the situation rather than having rules imposed on them in the court system. Those sorts of arrangements tend to experience less conflict between the couples. There's a greater level of fatherly involvement and better outcomes for children. Now, divorce and relationships with adult children have its own challenges. Disruptions also occur when divorced parents' relationship with their children, whether they're young or adults themselves. Young adults whose parents divorce experience a greater deal of emotional vulnerability and stress, and the effects of experiencing a divorce of one's parents while growing up can be long-lasting. Those of us who've experienced divorce, most of us, or at least a large portion of us, have dealt with the prospect of remarriage. Now, the trauma of divorce does not keep people from beginning new relationships, as you might think. Most tend to remarry, but women, on the other hand, are less likely to remarry than men. Some cultures make remarriage for widows absolutely impossible. Second marriages are especially vulnerable to stress when spouses must adjust to having stepchildren. And bear in mind, the research suggests that for individuals who marry a second or third time, the level of divorce percentages increases. The development of relationships across the lifespan is a complicated process. I'll be very curious to hear and to understand or learn more about how it is you do relationships as you move through your younger adulthood.